Welcome to a story with 18 enchanting chapters, each designed to calm your mind and guide you into restful sleep. As you listen, imagine yourself stepping into these worlds. What chapter feels most like your dreamland? Let us know in the comments below. Now, let's begin with Chapter 1.
The deeper she delved, the more intrigued she became. The Ashwood family's history read like a Gothic novel: wealth, scandal, forbidden love, and tragedy. And then there was the house itself, a sprawling estate with over 30 rooms, each rumored to have its own secret. How had no one ever pieced it all together? How had no one uncovered the truth? By the time Emily glanced at the clock, it was nearly 7 p.m. The newsroom had thinned out, and the hum of activity had dwindled to a low murmur. Her stomach growled, reminding her she hadn't eaten since lunch, but she ignored it. Instead, she grabbed her bag, stuffed the folder inside, and headed for the parking lot. The drive to Ashwood Manor would take about 40 minutes, just enough time for the sun to dip below the horizon. She debated waiting until morning, but her curiosity wouldn't let her. The sooner she saw the place for herself, the sooner she could start piecing together the story. As she navigated the winding country roads, the city lights gave way to darkness. Trees loomed on either side, their bare branches like skeletal fingers against the twilight sky. The GPS on her phone announced that she was nearing her destination, and a knot of anticipation tightened in her chest. Finally, she rounded a bend, and there it was, Ashwood Manor. It sat atop a hill, its silhouette stark against the dusky sky. The wrought iron gates, rusted and half open, creaked as the wind pushed them slightly. Beyond them, the long, overgrown driveway led to the house itself, a decaying relic of a bygone era. Emily parked her car just outside the gates, her headlights casting a pale glow on the overgrown path. For a moment, she sat there, staring at the manor, its dark windows like hollow eyes staring back. The air felt heavier here, as if the place carried the weight of its history. Shaking off the unease, she grabbed her camera, flashlight, and notebook, then stepped out of the car. The gravel crunched under her boots as she approached the gates. She paused to take a photo, capturing the eerie grandeur of the house, bathed in twilight. Pushing open the gates, she ventured up the driveway. The statues flanking the entrance were weathered and broken, their faces obscured by time. Ivy climbed the stone walls, and the wooden doors loomed ahead, massive and imposing. As she reached the doors, she hesitated. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to let fear get the better of her. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the doors open. They groaned on their hinges, and a musty scent wafted out to greet her. The grand foyer was like something out of a dream, or a nightmare. A massive chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals dulled by layers of dust. The marble floors were cracked and grimy, and the sweeping staircase leading to the upper floors seemed to disappear into shadows. Faded portraits lined the walls, their subjects staring out with lifeless eyes. Emily's flashlight beam cut through the darkness as she stepped inside. The air was cold, and her breath formed faint puffs in the dim light. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, but she told herself it was just her imagination. She snapped a few photos of the foyer, then jotted down notes about the details, the architecture, the decay, the oppressive silence. Despite the unease, she felt a spark of exhilaration. This was the kind of story she had always wanted, the kind that demanded to be uncovered. But as she stood there, surrounded by the weight of the past, she couldn't shake the sense that Ashwood Manor was more than just a story. It was a mystery waiting to be unraveled, and it had been waiting for her. The newsroom of the Daily Chronicle buzzed with its usual chaos. Telephones rang incessantly, journalists barked into their headsets, and keyboards clattered in a symphony of productivity. Emily Carter sat at her desk in the far corner, absently twirling a pen between her fingers. She stared at her computer screen, where a half-written story on the city council meeting languished, its lack of interest palpable even to her. "Carter!" The gruff voice of her editor, Mr. Thompson, cut through the noise like a whip. He stood in the doorway of his glass-walled office, a rolled-up newspaper in one hand and a coffee mug in the other. Emily bolted upright, nearly knocking her coffee cup over in the process. "Yes, sir?" "In my office now." Without waiting for a response, Thompson disappeared into his office, leaving the door open just wide enough to signal his impatience. Emily grabbed her notebook and pen, a mix of curiosity and dread swirling in her chest. Thompson was a hard man to read. One moment he was barking orders, and the next he was cracking dry jokes about deadlines. She had no idea what he wanted this time, but she prayed it wasn't another fluff piece. Stepping into his office, Emily was immediately greeted by the scent of stale coffee and cigar smoke. Thompson sat behind his cluttered desk, which was piled high with newspapers, sticky notes, and a framed photo of his golden retriever. "Close the door," he said, gesturing with his coffee mug. Emily obeyed, taking a seat across from him. She opened her notebook, ready to jot down whatever assignment he was about to throw her way. "I've got something different for you," Thompson said, leaning back in his chair. His eyes, sharp behind his wire-rimmed glasses, studied her for a moment. "How do you feel about ghost stories?" Emily raised an eyebrow. "Ghost stories?" He smirked. "Don't act like you're too good for it. You've been wanting something different, haven't you?" "Well, yes, but good, because I'm sending you to Ashwood Manor." The name sent a ripple of recognition through her. Ashwood Manor was a local legend, an abandoned estate on the outskirts of town that had been the subject of countless rumors and ghost stories for over a century. Stories of eerie lights, unexplained noises, and shadowy figures had made it a favorite haunt for thrill-seekers and urban explorers. But it wasn't just the supernatural element that intrigued people, it was the history. The Ashwood family had once been the pinnacle of wealth and influence, only to crumble under mysterious circumstances. "Think you can handle it?" Thompson asked, his smirk turning into a grin. Emily's competitive spirit flared. "I can handle anything you throw at me." "Good answer." He slid a manila folder across the desk. "This has everything we've got on the place. Background info, old articles, that sort of thing. I want a piece that'll make people shiver in their chairs. Something they'll talk about. Got it?" Emily nodded, taking the folder. "Got it." As she left his office, a strange mix of excitement and apprehension settled over her. She had always been drawn to stories with depth, with layers to uncover, and Ashwood Manor seemed to have plenty of both. But ghost stories? That was uncharted territory for her. Back at her desk, she opened the folder and began to sift through its contents. There were black and white photos of the manor from the early 1900s, its stone facade grand and imposing against a backdrop of rolling hills. There were copies of old articles detailing the mysterious disappearance of Lillian Ashwood, the youngest daughter of the family, and the subsequent deaths of her parents within the same year. There were also modern accounts, grainy photos taken by ghost hunters, blurry at best, and eyewitness testimonies that range from chillingly specific to outright absurd.
"I heard you were digging into Ashwood Manor," he said, stopping just inside the gates. "Figured I'd come by and see if you needed a guide." Emily raised an eyebrow. "And you just happen to know I'd be here tonight?" He shrugged. "Call it a hunch. Besides, this place is dangerous. Thought you could use some backup." She wasn't sure whether to be annoyed or relieved. On the one hand, she hadn't asked for his help. On the other, the idea of exploring the manor alone had been daunting. Maybe having an expert on hand wouldn't be such a bad thought. "Well, you're here now," she said. "I suppose you can tag along, but don't get in my way." Samuel grinned. Wouldn't dream of it. Together they stepped back into the manor, the doors groaning shut behind them. For the first time, Emily felt a flicker of something other than fear, something that almost resembled hope. Perhaps she wasn't as alone in this investigation as she thought.
Determined to shake off the unease, she approached one of the portraits for a closer look. The young girl in the painting stared back at her, her smile strangely enigmatic. Beneath the portrait was a brass plaque that read, "Lillian Ashwood, 1872. Emily's pulse quickened. Lillian had disappeared in 1890, according to the articles she had read. She would have been just 18. What had happened to her? Was she still somewhere in this house, trapped in some way Emily couldn't yet understand? She jotted down notes in her journal, detailing the portrait and the questions swirling in her mind. There was so much to uncover, so many pieces of the puzzle yet to find. The sound of a car engine broke her concentration. Emily turned toward the door, confused. She hadn't seen another vehicle when she arrived, and she doubted anyone else would come here at this hour. Grabbing her flashlight and camera, she made her way back to the front entrance. Peeking out, she saw headlights cutting through the darkness, growing brighter as a car pulled up to the gates. The vehicle came to a stop, and the engine died. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall and lanky, with a leather satchel slung over his shoulder. His face was partially obscured by the brim of a hat, but as he moved closer, Emily recognized him. "Samuel?" she called, stepping out onto the porch. The man looked up, startled. "Emily, what are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," she said, descending the steps. Samuel Thompson was a local historian she had met briefly during a prior assignment. He specialized in old properties and had an encyclopedic knowledge of the town's history. The last glimmers of sunlight faded as Emily stood at the threshold of Ashwood Manor. The wooden doors loomed before her, carved with intricate patterns now blurred by age and neglect. The sheer scale of them made her feel small, insignificant, a visitor in a place that had stood untouched for decades. She hesitated, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the door handle. The air here was different, heavy with an unexplainable tension. It was as though the manor itself was aware of her presence, watching, waiting. Emily stepped back for a moment, her journal tucked under one arm as she took in the full view of the facade. The manor was enormous, its once pristine stone exterior now a canvas of decay. Ivy crept up the walls like greedy fingers, choking the life out of the cracked stone. The windows, dark and gaping, reflected nothing but shadows. There were no lights, no signs of life, just an oppressive stillness that made her stomach twist. She pulled out her camera, adjusting the lens to capture the manor in all its eerie glory. As the shutter clicked, she couldn't help but think about the stories she had read in the folder. The rumors of ghostly apparitions in the windows, strange lights that flickered in the dead of night. Even now, as she peered through the camera's viewfinder, she half expected to see something, or someone, staring back at her. She lowered the camera and took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. The journalist in her demanded logic, rationality. The supernatural tales were just that, tales. If she wanted to uncover the truth, she couldn't let fear cloud her judgment. Turning her attention to the pathway leading to the main entrance, she noticed it was overgrown with weeds and moss. The gravel beneath her boots crunched softly, the sound unnaturally loud in the otherwise silent evening. On either side of the path, statues stood like sentinels, their features weathered and indistinct. One was of a man in a flowing cloak, his face nearly eroded to nothing. Another depicted a woman with her hands clasped in prayer, her expression lost to time. Both figures exuded an air of melancholy, as though they too had been trapped here, forgotten. Reaching the steps, Emily paused to study the porch. The wooden boards were warped and cracked, and the balustrade was missing several spindles. She made a mental note to be careful. Falling through rotted wood was not on her list of career milestones. "Here goes nothing," she muttered to herself, climbing the stairs. The door handle was cold under her touch, and when she pushed, the door resisted, groaning as though reluctant to let her in. With a bit more force, it gave way, and Emily stepped inside. The air inside the manor was cooler than she expected, tinged with a damp, musty odor. Dust motes floated in the beam of her flashlight as she swept it across the grand foyer. She had seen photographs of the space, but they didn't do it justice. Even in its dilapidated state, the room was breathtaking. The centerpiece was the staircase, a sweeping marvel of craftsmanship that curved elegantly to the upper floors. The banister, once polished to a shine, was now dulled and splintered. The steps were worn, their edges softened by time and use. Above the staircase, a massive chandelier hung precariously, its crystals dulled and cobwebbed. Emily turned her flashlight toward the walls, which were lined with portraits. The Ashwood family, she assumed. The figures stared out at her, their expressions captured in oil paint, but somehow still unsettling. There was a man with a sharp jawline and piercing eyes, a woman in a flowing gown, and a young girl with curly hair and a mischievous smile. Lillian, perhaps? The name sprang to Emily's mind, though she couldn't be sure. A noise broke the silence, a faint creak from somewhere upstairs. Emily froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She strained her ears, but the sound didn't repeat. Probably just the house settling, she told herself. Old buildings made noise. It was nothing to be alarmed about. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Shaking her head, she focused on her surroundings, determined to stay objective. She began taking photos of the foyer, framing each shot carefully. Through the lens, she noticed details she hadn't seen before. The intricate carvings on the fireplace mantel, the faded pattern on the wallpaper, and the way the light caught the dust particles, making them shimmer like tiny stars. The next photo she took was of the chandelier. As she adjusted the focus, she thought she saw movement out of the corner of her eye, a shadow passing across the far end of the room. Her hands trembled slightly as she lowered the camera and turned her flashlight toward the spot. Nothing. Just the empty expanse of the foyer with its peeling wallpaper and crumbling plaster. Emily exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cold air. She was letting her imagination get the better of her. "This was Mr. Ashwood's domain," Samuel said, shining his light over the desk. "He was a scholar, or at least he fancied himself one. Spent most of his time in here." Emily began rifling through the papers, careful not to damage them further. Most were illegible, the ink faded or smudged. But one document caught her eye, a letter written in a flowing script. The date at the top read, March 3rd, 1890. "What's that?" Samuel asked, leaning over her shoulder. "It's a letter. I think it's from Lillian." Emily squinted at the faded text, reading aloud. "To my dearest, I cannot bear this any longer. The walls of this house feel like a prison, and I fear I may go mad if I stay. They do not understand our love. They say it is forbidden, but I know in my heart it is pure. If only we could escape together, far from here, far from them. Yours always, L. Emily's voice trailed off, her heart racing. This was more than just a clue. It was a window into Lillian's mind, her desperation, her longing. What do you think happened to her? Emily asked, turning to Samuel. I don't know, he admitted. But it's clear she wanted to leave. Maybe she did, or maybe... He didn't finish the thought, but the implication hung in the air. Their next stop was the second floor. The staircase creaked ominously under their weight, and Emily gripped the banister tightly, half expecting it to give way. The upper level was even darker than the first, the air heavier, more suffocating. This is where the bedrooms are, Samuel said, including Lillian's. The hallway stretched before them, lined with closed doors. Emily felt a pang of unease as they passed each one, the thought of what might be waiting behind them making her pulse quicken. At the end of the hall was a door slightly ajar, its paint peeling in long strips. This was hers, Samuel said, stopping in front of it. Emily pushed the door open, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The room was small, modest compared to the rest of the house. A four-poster bed stood against one wall, its canopy shredded and hanging in tatters. A vanity sat opposite it, the mirror cracked and clouded with grime. But what caught Emily's attention was the writing desk beneath the window. Papers were scattered across its surface, as though someone had left in a hurry. She approached it cautiously, her flashlight revealing more fragments of letters, all written in the same flowing script. Samuel stood by the window, peering out at the overgrown gardens below. She must have spent hours in here, dreaming of a life outside these walls. Emily picked up one of the letters, her eyes scanning the words. It was another plea for escape, another declaration of love. She felt a pang of sadness for Lillian, for the life she had been denied. A sudden noise made them both freeze, a faint, melodic humming. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. It seemed to come from the hallway, growing louder with each passing second. Emily and Samuel exchanged a look, their expressions mirrored in fear and disbelief. Without a word, they stepped back into the hall, the humming surrounding them like a ghostly echo. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The heavy doors of Ashwood Manor groaned shut behind Emily and Samuel, sealing them in the oppressive silence of the grand foyer. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of damp wood and decay. Dust hung in the faint beam of Emily's flashlight, giving the space an almost dreamlike quality. The vastness of the room enveloped them, the echoes of their footsteps bouncing off the high ceilings and marble floors. "So," Samuel said, his voice breaking the silence, "this is your big story?" Emily glanced over her shoulder at him. "What? You don't think it's worth it?" "Oh, it's worth it," he replied, stepping farther into the room. "This place is practically dripping with history and mystery. Just don't expect to walk out of here with all the answers." Emily raised an eyebrow but didn't reply. Instead, she turned her attention to the space around her. The chandelier above, its crystals dulled by decades of grime, swayed faintly as if moved by an unseen breeze. The grand staircase loomed ahead, its mahogany banister warped and splintered. On the walls, faded portraits watched them with painted eyes, their faces frozen in expressions that seemed to shift under the flickering light. Samuel moved toward the fireplace, his boots stirring up little clouds of dust. "Did you know this mantelpiece was carved by hand? The Ashwoods imported artisans from Europe to build this place. They spared no expense." Emily snapped a photo of the intricate carvings. The light from her flash illuminated the room for a split second. and for just a moment she thought she saw something move in the shadows. She froze, her heart pounding. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Samuel turned. "See what?" "There was something over there." She pointed toward the far end of the room, where the shadows were deepest, but when Samuel shone his flashlight in that direction, there was nothing. "It's probably just your mind playing tricks on you," he said. "This place has that effect on people." Emily frowned but didn't press the issue. She couldn't let her imagination get the better of her, not if she wanted to stay focused. The two of them continued their exploration, moving deeper into the manor. Every room they entered seemed to tell its own story of abandonment. The dining hall was vast, with a long table at its center that was now warped and covered in dust. Cobwebs stretched between the candelabras, and the faded wallpaper was peeling in long, curling strips. Samuel ran a hand over the back of one of the chairs. This was where the Ashwoods entertained their guests. Lavish parties, elaborate dinners. You can almost hear the laughter if you listen closely. Emily shivered. She didn't want to admit it, but there was a strange energy in the house, a weight that seemed to press down on her the farther they went. It wasn't just the chill in the air, or the creaks of the old wood beneath their feet. It was something deeper, something unspoken. "What do you know about Lillian?" she asked as they moved toward the parlor. Samuel glanced at her. "Lillian Ashwood. She was the youngest daughter, disappeared when she was 18. The official story is that she ran away, but, well, you've read the rumors." Emily nodded. She had read more than rumors. The diary entries she had found in the library hinted at a forbidden love, a relationship that her family would have never approved of. But the details were vague, fragmented, as though someone had deliberately tried to erase parts of her story. They entered the parlor, a room dominated by a grand piano that sat at its center like a forgotten relic. Its once glossy surface was now dulled by dust, and several of the keys were chipped or missing. Emily approached it cautiously, running her fingers over the edge of the instrument. "This is where the Ashwoods used to gather in the evenings," Samuel said. Music was a big part of their lives. Lillian was especially gifted, or so they say. She could play for hours. Emily nodded, her hand resting on the keys. A strange impulse made her press one, and the resulting note was low and mournful, echoing through the room like a ghostly sigh. She immediately regretted it, the sound sending a chill up her spine. "Maybe don't do that," Samuel said with a nervous chuckle. "Agreed," Emily muttered, stepping away. As they continued their exploration, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching them. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of their flashlights seemed amplified in the oppressive silence. The portraits on the walls seemed to follow them with their eyes, and the faint scent of lavender, so out of place in this decaying space, lingered in the air. They made their way to the library, a cavernous room lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves. Most of the books were still in place, their spines cracked and faded. A large desk sat in the center, its surface cluttered with yellowed papers and an old oil lamp. They descended the staircase, their footsteps echoing in the empty space. The grand foyer stretched before them, its shadows deeper now that night had fully fallen. The chandelier above creaked faintly, swaying ever so slightly despite the lack of a breeze. Emily felt a chill run down her spine as they crossed the foyer. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to press down on her, making it harder to breathe. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the figure again, but the space behind them was empty. "Where should we check next?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Samuel gestured toward a set of double doors on the left. "The drawing room. It's where the family spent most of their evenings." Emily nodded. and together they pushed open the doors. The drawing room was just as dilapidated as the rest of the house. The furniture was covered in dust, the upholstery torn and faded. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth filled with charred remnants of logs long since burned out. As Emily stepped farther into the room, something caught her eye, a faint glow emanating from the far corner. She froze, her flashlight trained on the source of the light. It was a small, gilded mirror hanging on the wall, its surface reflecting an ethereal, flickering glow. "Do you see that?" she whispered to Samuel. He nodded, his expression tense. "It's not the flashlight, that's something else." Emily approached the mirror cautiously, her heart pounding. As she drew closer, the glow intensified, and she could see faint images swirling within the glass. It was as though the mirror held a memory, a fragment of the past playing out before her eyes. The image was of a young woman, Lillian, Emily realized, sitting at the grand piano in the parlor. Her fingers moved gracefully over the keys, and though Emily couldn't hear the music, she could almost feel its melody. A man stood behind her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. His face was obscured, but the tenderness in his posture was unmistakable. Then the scene changed. The man was gone and Lillian was alone, her expression one of despair. She clutched a letter to her chest, her shoulders shaking as though she was sobbing. The glow faded and the mirror returned to its normal state, its surface reflecting only Emily's pale face. "What did you see?" Samuel asked, stepping closer. "Lillian," Emily said, her voice barely a whisper. "And someone else, a man? I think he was the one she loved." Samuel's expression darkened. If he was the reason she wanted to leave, that might explain a lot. The Ashwoods would never have approved of her marrying someone beneath their station. Emily nodded, her mind racing. The images in the mirror were fragments, pieces of a larger story she was determined to uncover. But the more she learned, the more questions she had. Who was the man in the mirror? What had happened to Lillian after the night she wrote her final letter? And why did her spirit still linger in this place, trapped in the echoes of her own tragedy? Before they could discuss it further, a sudden sound made them both jump, a sharp, metallic clang, like the slamming of a door. It came from the direction of the parlor. Emily and Samuel exchanged a tense glance before hurrying toward the sound. The parlor was exactly as they had left it, the grand piano sitting silent and still in the center of the room. But something was different. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and the faint scent of lavender was stronger than ever. Emily's flashlight flickered, the beam dimming for a moment before returning to full strength. She clenched it tighter, her pulse quickening. "Do you feel that?" Samuel nodded. "She's still here?" Suddenly the piano keys moved, striking a single, haunting note that echoed through the room. Emily gasped, stepping back as the keys moved again, playing a slow, mournful melody. There was no one sitting at the piano, no one visible, at least. "Lillian," Emily whispered, her voice trembling, "is that you?" The melody stopped abruptly and the room fell silent once more. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps, her mind racing. This wasn't just a ghost story, this was something real, something tangible. And she was right in the middle of it. The silence that followed the humming was so profound that Emily could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. She stood frozen in the dark hallway, her flashlight beam trembling as she swept it back and forth. Samuel was beside her, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and determination. "You heard that, right?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Samuel nodded. "I heard it." Neither of them moved for what felt like an eternity. The hallway stretched before them, lined with doors that seemed to recede into the darkness. The faint scent of lavender lingered in the air, mingling with the musty smell of decay. Emily's grip tightened on her flashlight, her fingers slick with sweat. "Where did it come from?" she asked, her voice shaking. Samuel pointed toward the far end of the hallway. "That way. Near the stairwell, I think." Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, to get back to the safety of her car, but her curiosity was stronger. If she turned back now, she'd never uncover the truth behind the manor's mysteries. "Let's check it out," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Samuel raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. Together they crept down the hallway, their footsteps muffled by the dust-covered floor. The doors on either side seemed to watch them, their keyholes dark and empty like hollow eyes. The lavender scent grew stronger as they approached the stairwell, filling the air with an almost overpowering sweetness. When they reached the end of the hall, Emily stopped. She shone her flashlight toward the staircase, the beam illuminating the banister and the cracked marble steps. For a moment, there was nothing, just the stillness of the house and the faint creak of wood settling. Then she saw it. At the top of the staircase, barely visible in the dim light, stood a figure. It was a woman, her form faint and translucent, as though she were made of mist. She wore a flowing gown that shimmered faintly, and her hair cascaded down her back in loose curls. Her face was obscured, but Emily could feel the weight of her gaze, the intensity of her presence. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Her legs felt rooted to the spot, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. She raised her camera with trembling hands, snapping a photo. The flash illuminated the staircase for a split second, and when the light faded, the figure was gone. "Did you see that?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "I saw it," Samuel said, his tone hushed. His face was pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. That had to be Lillian." Emily glanced at her camera, scrolling through the photos. The staircase appeared empty in every frame. No ghostly figure, no shimmering gown, just shadows and dust. "I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. She was right there. Samuel ran a hand through his hair, his expression troubled. "Spirits don't always show up in photographs. Sometimes they're tied to the moment, to the energy of the person seeing them." Emily frowned. "You sound like you've done this before." "I've read a lot," Samuel admitted, "but seeing it is different." Determined to make sense of what they'd just witnessed, Emily and Samuel decided to investigate the area around the staircase. They moved carefully, their flashlights casting long shadows across the walls. The faint scent of lavender still lingered, a reminder of the figure they had seen. Emily noticed something on the banister, a small, delicate handprint etched into the layer of dust. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there. "Look at this," she said, pointing it out to Samuel. He leaned closer, his brow furrowing. "That's not possible. No one's been here in years." Emily took a photo of the handprint, her mind racing. Was it evidence of Lillian's presence? Or was there another explanation, one she hadn't yet considered? "Let's keep moving," Samuel said, his voice low. "I don't think she's gone." "This is what we know," Emily said, pointing to a photograph of the manor. The Ashwoods were at the height of their wealth and power in the late 1800s. Lillian was their youngest daughter, and by all accounts, she was talented, well-liked, and destined for a bright future. Samuel nodded, but then she falls in love with someone the family disapproves of. Whoever he wasn't wealthy or influential enough for the Ashwoods. That would have been enough to create tension, especially in a family as traditional as theirs. Emily picked up the March 6th article. Then she disappears. The family claims she left of her own accord, but there are eyewitness accounts of a scream that night. Within a year, the entire family is dead and the house is abandoned. Samuel tapped a finger on the table. It's almost as if the manor itself is cursed. Emily gave him a skeptical look. You don't really believe in curses, do you? Samuel shrugged. After what we saw last night, I'm willing to believe just about anything. That evening they returned to Ashwood Manor, armed with their newfound knowledge and a plan to investigate further. The sun was setting as they pulled up to the gates, casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn. The house loomed ahead, its dark windows reflecting the fiery hues of the sunset. "Ready?" Samuel asked, pulling a flashlight from his bag. Emily nodded, her heart pounding. "Let's do this." The interior of the manor was just as they had left it, though the oppressive atmosphere seemed even heavier now that night was falling. They made their way to the parlour, where the piano sat in its usual eerie silence. "This is where I saw the glowing mirror," Emily said, shining her flashlight around the room. "And the vision of Lillian." Samuel approached the piano, his hand hovering over the keys. "Do you think she's still here?" Emily hesitated before answering. "I don't know, but if she is, we need to find a way to communicate with her." As if in response, a sudden gust of cold air swept through the room, extinguishing their flashlights and plunging them into darkness. Emily's breath caught in her throat as a faint light began to glow in the corner of the room. It was the mirror, its surface shimmering like liquid silver. "Emily," Samuel whispered, his voice tight with fear. "What's happening?" "I think she's trying to tell us something," Emily replied, her voice trembling. The images in the mirror began to shift, replaying the same scene Emily had seen the night before. Lillian at the piano, the mysterious man standing behind her, and the moment of despair as she clutched the letter to her chest. But this time, the vision didn't end. Instead, it shifted to the grand staircase, where a struggle seemed to be taking place. Lillian was there, her face contorted in fear. A man, a different man, older and more imposing, grabbed her arm, dragging her up the stairs. Her screams echoed faintly, and then the vision faded. Emily stared at the mirror, her mind racing. "She didn't run away," she said, her voice shaking. "She was taken." Samuel's expression was grim. "By who?" Emily turned to him, her eyes wide. "Her father." The following morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of the Ravenswood Public Library, illuminating the dust motes that floated lazily in the air. Emily sat at a wooden table in the corner, surrounded by stacks of books, old newspapers, and photocopied documents. Her laptop sat open in front of her, its screen glowing with the beginnings of an article that felt more incomplete with every new discovery. Despite the warmth of the sun and the hum of quiet activity in the library, Emily couldn't shake the chill that had followed her from Ashwood Manor. The events of the previous night played over and over in her mind, the spectral figure at the top of the staircase, the glowing mirror, and the haunting piano melody. She had spent hours tossing and turning, replaying every detail and trying to make sense of it. Samuel arrived a few minutes later, a steaming cup of coffee in one hand and a folder in the other. He slid into the chair across from her, placing the folder on the table. "Morning," he said, his voice low but cheerful. "You look like you didn't sleep." "I didn't," Emily admitted, taking a sip from her own, now cold coffee. "Too much to process." Samuel nodded. "That's the thing about Ashwood Manor. It gets under your skin." He opened the folder, revealing a collection of documents and photographs. I did some digging of my own this morning. Figured we should compare notes. Emily leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. What did you find? For starters, Samuel said, pulling out an old photograph. This is a picture of Lillian Ashwood from 1889, about a year before she disappeared. Emily studied the photo. Lillian was strikingly beautiful, with delicate features and an air of melancholy that seemed to radiate from the image. She was seated at the grand piano, her hands poised over the keys. A shadowy figure stood in the background, partially obscured by the edge of the frame. "Who's that?" Emily asked, pointing to the figure. "That's the mystery," Samuel replied. "Some people think it was her music instructor. Others say it was a servant. Whoever he was, he doesn't show up in any official records. But there's a lot of speculation that he was the man she fell in love with." Emily's mind raced. The figure in the photograph matched the vague impression she had seen in the glowing mirror. Could this man be the key to understanding Lillian's story? The rest of the morning was spent combing through the library's archives. Samuel focused on property records and official documents, while Emily delved into the local newspaper archives, searching for any mention of Lillian or the Ashwood family. The articles painted a picture of a family once at the pinnacle of wealth and influence. Parties at Ashwood Manor were the talk of the town, and the Ashwoods were known for their generosity and taste. But beneath the surface, cracks began to show. There were rumours of infidelity, business disputes, and a growing tension within the family. Lillian's disappearance in 1890 marked the beginning of the family's downfall. Within a year, both of her parents were dead, her father from a sudden illness, her mother from an apparent accident. The estate was abandoned shortly afterward, left to decay. Emily found an article dated March the 6th, 1890, just days after Lillian had disappeared. The headline read, "Ashwood heiress missing, family declines comment." She scanned the article, which detailed the family's refusal to involve the police and their insistence that Lillian had simply gone to visit relatives. The tone of the article was skeptical, hinting at the possibility of a scandal. "Listen to this," Emily said, reading aloud. "Neighbours report hearing raised voices at Ashwood Manor on the night of Miss Ashwood's disappearance. One witness, who asked to remain anonymous, described hearing a woman scream." Samuel looked up from the property records. "That doesn't sound like someone who left willingly." "No, it doesn't," Emily agreed, her brow furrowed. "If she ran away, why wouldn't the family want the police involved? It's like they were trying to cover something up." Samuel leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. What if they weren't covering up her disappearance? What if they were covering up what happened to her? Emily's stomach turned at the implication. "You think she was murdered?" "It's possible," Samuel said carefully. "But if that's the case, where's the body? And why would her spirit still be tied to the house?" Emily didn't have an answer. The questions only seemed to multiply, each one more troubling than the last. By the early afternoon, Emily and Samuel had gathered enough material to piece together a rough timeline of events. They spread the documents and photos across the table, creating a visual map of the Ashwood family's history. Samuel stepped forward, his hand resting on the door's handle. It creaked loudly as he pushed it open, revealing a small, windowless room. The air inside was even colder, and the faint scent of lavender was overwhelming. At the center of the room was a small cot, its mattress stained and torn. Chains hung from the walls, their iron links rusted but still sturdy. Emily's stomach turned at the sight. "She was kept here," Samuel said, his voice trembling with anger. "Her own father did this to her." Emily felt a wave of nausea as she stepped into the room. The weight of Lillian's suffering was palpable, pressing down on her like a physical force. She reached for her camera, taking photos of the room and its horrific contents. As the flash illuminated the space, a figure appeared in the corner. Lillian. Her form was faint but unmistakable, her eyes filled with sorrow and anger. "He kept me here," Lillian said, her voice trembling. "He said it was for my own good, that I would thank him one day." Emily's hands trembled as she held the camera. "Lillian, what happened to you? How did it end?" Lillian's gaze shifted to the far wall, where a faint stain marred the stone. "He said I would never leave, and he made sure of it." The room grew colder still, and the lights of their flashlights flickered. Lillian's form began to fade, her voice barely a whisper as she spoke her final words. "You must find him. He must answer for what he's done." And then she was gone. The revelation that Lillian had been taken by her father, not willingly left Ashwood Manor, weighed heavily on Emily as she and Samuel stood in the darkened parlour. The mirror's glow had faded, leaving the room once again bathed in cold, oppressive silence. Emily's flashlight flickered back to life, the beam jittering as her trembling hand moved across the room. "She didn't just disappear," Emily murmured. Her voice was heavy with the weight of understanding. "Her father? He knew something. He must have covered it up." Samuel nodded grimly. "It explains why the family was so quick to dismiss the idea of an investigation. But why would he do it? What could have driven him to such an extreme?" Emily shook her head, unsure of how to answer. She could feel the story deepening with every new discovery. But the more she uncovered, the more questions arose. It was as if the manor itself was forcing her to untangle the truth, one agonizing thread at a time. As they left the parlour to investigate further, the temperature in the house seemed to plummet. Emily pulled her coat tighter around her, shivering, as she followed Samuel into the hallway. The floorboards groaned beneath their feet, the sound amplified in the vast, empty space. The faint scent of lavender returned, drifting through the air like a ghostly presence. "It's getting colder," Emily said, her breath visible in the flashlight's beam. "Do you feel that?" Samuel nodded, his eyes scanning the shadows. "It's not just the temperature. Something's changing." As they climbed the grand staircase, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows seemed to shift and dance at the edge of her vision, and every creak of the floorboards made her heart race. She reached for her camera, taking photos as they ascended. The flash illuminated the hallway for brief moments, revealing nothing out of the ordinary. At least, not at first. When they reached the second floor, Emily felt a strange pull toward Lillian's bedroom. The door, which had been slightly ajar the night before, now stood wide open, as if inviting them in. She hesitated, glancing at Samuel. "You don't have to come," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily closed the diary, her chest tight with emotion. "She knew," she said quietly. "She knew he was going to do something to her." Samuel's expression was grim. And he did. He locked her in that cellar and left her there. Emily shook her head. It doesn't make sense. If he wanted to stop her from running away, why not just keep her in her room? Why the cellar? Samuel hesitated, then said, "Maybe it wasn't just about stopping her. Maybe it was about punishment." The thought sent a chill down Emily's spine. She stood, clutching the diary to her chest. "We need to find out more about her father. There has to be something in this house. Letters, records, anything." Samuel nodded. "Let's split up. Cover more ground. If you find anything, call out." Emily hesitated, the thought of being alone in the house unnerving. But she nodded, knowing it was the fastest way to gather more information. She moved to the master bedroom, the room that had once belonged to Lillian's parents. The door creaked loudly as she pushed it open, and the smell of mildew hit her immediately. The room was grand but decayed, its once fine furnishings now rotting with age. A massive four-poster bed dominated the space, its canopy torn and sagging. Emily's flashlight beam swept across the room, landing on a writing desk near the window. She approached it cautiously, her pulse quickening. The desk was smaller than Lillian's, but its drawers were locked. Frustrated, Emily searched the room for something to pry them open. She found a small iron poker near the fireplace and used it to jimmy the lock. The drawer finally gave way, revealing a stack of yellowed letters tied with a faded ribbon. Emily's hands trembled as she untied the ribbon and began to read. The letters were written by Edward Ashwood, Lillian's father, to an unnamed correspondent. They detailed his growing frustration with his daughter, his belief that she was being led astray by a wicked influence. One letter, dated March 6, 1890, caught her attention. "I have done what I must to protect the Ashwood name. She will not disgrace us, not while I am still alive. The boy is gone, and she will remain where I have placed her until she understands her duty to this family. I do not expect her to thank me, but I will not have her ruin everything I have worked for." Emily's blood ran cold. The boy is gone. What did that mean? Had Lillian's father done something to the man she loved? She hurried out of the room, clutching the letters. "Samuel!" she called, her voice echoing through the empty halls. Samuel appeared at the top of the staircase, his face pale. "What is it?" Emily held up the letters. "Her father. He didn't just imprison her. He got rid of the man she loved. And I think he killed him." Samuel's expression darkened. "That means Lillian wasn't just a victim, she was a witness. And if she's still here, it's because she wants justice." Emily nodded. "We need to find out who he was and what happened to him." As they stood there, the house seemed to groan around them, the walls shuddering as if in response to their discovery. Emily could feel it in her bones. The truth was closer than ever, but so was the danger. The weight of Lillian's final words hung heavy in the air as Emily and Samuel stood in the suffocating darkness of the cellar. The small room, with its chains and stained walls, told a story far more horrifying than Emily had anticipated. Lillian had been a prisoner in her own home, silenced by the man who was supposed to protect her. "We need to go back upstairs," Emily said, her voice shaky but firm. She felt an urgency she couldn't explain, as if the house itself was demanding that they keep moving. Samuel nodded silently, his jaw tight with anger. He followed her up the creaking staircase, and they emerged into the dilapidated kitchen, where the air felt slightly less oppressive, but no less heavy with tension. Neither of them spoke as they moved through the house, their flashlights casting long, shifting shadows on the walls. As they entered the grand foyer, Emily's thoughts churned. They had uncovered pieces of Lillian's story, her forbidden love, her imprisonment. But there were still so many unanswered questions. Who was the man she loved? What had ultimately happened to her in that cellar? And what had driven her father to such cruelty? Emily's gaze fell on the grand staircase, its banister worn and splintered with age. An idea struck her, unbidden but insistent. "Her bedroom," she said suddenly. Samuel frowned. "What about it?" "There has to be more up there. Lillian's diary, her letters, something that tells the full story." Samuel hesitated, glancing toward the shadows at the top of the stairs. The house had been unnerving enough already, and the thought of venturing deeper into its mysteries clearly unsettled him. But he nodded, his expression resolute. Let's find it. The second floor was colder than before, and the scent of lavender was stronger, as though Lillian's presence lingered there more heavily than in any other part of the house. Emily led the way to Lillian's bedroom, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The room looked the same as it had the night before, but something felt different. The air was heavier, more charged, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Emily moved to the writing desk beneath the window, her fingers brushing over the scattered letters. There has to be more, she murmured, opening the desk's drawers one by one. Most were empty, their contents long since removed or decayed. But when she reached the bottom drawer, it stuck as she tried to pull it open. "Help me," she said, glancing at Samuel. He knelt beside her, gripping the edge of the drawer. Together they pulled, and with a loud creak, the drawer slid open. Inside was a leather-bound book, its cover worn and faded. Emily's heart leapt as she carefully lifted it out. "It's her diary," she whispered, her fingers trembling as she opened the cover. The first few pages were filled with neat, flowing script, detailing Lillian's daily life, her lessons, her love of music, her dreams of seeing the world beyond Ashwood Manor. But as Emily flipped through the pages, the tone shifted. The entries became more frantic, the handwriting more hurried. March 1st, 1890, I cannot take much more of this. Father watches my every move as if he knows. I try to act as I always have, but I can feel his suspicion growing. He asks me questions about where I go, who I speak to. I told him nothing, of course, but I fear it is only a matter of time. March 3rd, 1890. He found one of the letters. I tried to tell him it was nothing, just a passing fancy, but he didn't believe me. He said I was foolish, that I didn't understand what I was risking. He tore the letter to pieces right in front of me and told me I was never to see him again. But how can I stop? How can I turn my back on the one person who makes me feel alive? March 5th, 1890. It is worse than I feared. Father has locked me in my room. He says it is for my own good, that he is protecting me from myself. But I know the truth. He is protecting his precious reputation. He would rather see me miserable than happy, so long as the Ashwood name remains untarnished. Emily's hands shook as she read the final entry. March 7th, 1890. He knows everything. I don't know how, but he does. He came into my room tonight, his face pale with rage. He said I had brought shame upon the family, that I had betrayed him. I tried to reason with him, but he wouldn't listen. He said I would understand one day, that I would thank him for saving me from ruin. I don't know what he means, but I fear the worst. Samuel nodded, his fingers drumming on the steering wheel. There's one place we haven't checked yet, the church. If they met at a social there, it's possible someone at the church kept records, old registries, attendance lists, something. Emily glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was late, but not too late. Let's go. The Ravenswood Church was an imposing stone structure at the edge of town, its stained glass windows dark in the moonlight. Emily and Samuel parked in the gravel lot and approached the heavy wooden doors. To their relief, they were unlocked. Inside, the church was quiet and dimly lit, the air filled with the faint scent of wax and incense. Rows of pews stretched toward the altar, where a simple cross hung against the stone wall. Emily's footsteps echoed softly as she approached a small office to the side of the sanctuary. An older woman sat behind a desk, her glasses perched on the edge of her nose as she read from a leather-bound ledger. She looked up as they entered, her expression curious but kind. "Can I help you?" she asked. "We're hoping to look at some old records," Samuel said. "From the late 1800s, specifically. It's for a historical project." The woman nodded. "You're in luck. We've kept meticulous records since the church was founded. What exactly are you looking for?" Emily hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "We're looking for information about a man named Thomas Wren. He would have been a member of the congregation around 1890. The woman's brow furrowed. "Thomas Wren, that name sounds familiar. Give me a moment." She disappeared into a back room and returned a few minutes later with a large, dusty ledger. She set it on the desk and opened it carefully, flipping through the pages until she found the right section. "Here we are," she said, pointing to a line of text. "Thomas Wren. He attended regularly until March 1890. Then he stopped." Emily's heart pounded as she read the entry. There was no explanation, no follow-up, just an abrupt end to his attendance. "What happened to him?" she asked, her voice tight. The woman shook her head. "I don't know, but there's something else you should see." She flipped to another page, this one marked April 1890. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she read the entry. Memorial service for Thomas Wren. Cause of death? Accidental drowning. "Drowning?" Emily whispered. "That doesn't make sense. Why would he—" Samuel leaned closer, his jaw clenched. It wasn't an accident. Emily's mind raced. If Thomas's death had been staged, it was another piece of evidence pointing to Edward Ashwood's guilt. But how could they prove it? And how could they bring peace to Lillian, whose spirit still lingered in the manor, waiting for justice? As they left the church, Emily felt a renewed sense of determination. The pieces were starting to come together, but the full truth was still out there, buried in the shadows of Ashwood Manor. The sun was setting over Ravenswood when Emily and Samuel returned to the small cafe on the edge of town, their arms heavy with the documents and letters they had gathered from Ashwood Manor. The place was quiet, the hum of conversations low and comforting after the oppressive silence of the manor. The aroma of coffee and freshly baked bread did little to ease the tension between them, though. Emily spread the letters out on the small table, her eyes scanning each page as she sipped her coffee. Samuel sat across from her, scrolling through his phone, looking up records he thought might fill in the gaps left by Lillian's diary and her father's chilling correspondence. "We're missing something," Emily said, leaning back in her chair. "The boy. Lillian's father said he got rid of him, but there's no record of who he was or what actually happened." Samuel nodded, his brow furrowed in concentration. He must have been someone from the town, someone Lillian met outside the walls of the manor. If we can figure out who he was, we might get closer to understanding why Edward Ashwood went to such extremes. Emily sighed, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "But where do we even start? It's not like the Ashwoods kept a list of everyone their daughter interacted with." "Maybe not," Samuel said, setting his phone down. "But I know someone who might have an idea." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Who?" "There's a man named Albert Hawthorne. He's a local historian, retired professor. He's been researching the Ashwood family for decades. If anyone knows who Lillian might have been involved with, it's him." Emily perked up. "Can we talk to him?" Samuel glanced at the clock on the cafe wall. "If we hurry, we can catch him before he turns in for the night. He's not much for late-night visitors." Albert Hawthorne's house was exactly what Emily had expected from a historian. The small brick cottage was lined with overflowing flower beds, and the interior was packed with bookshelves, antique furniture, and framed maps of Ravenswood from centuries past. The air smelled faintly of old paper and pipe tobacco. Albert himself was an older man, tall and wiry, with sharp blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He greeted them at the door with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, but when Samuel explained their purpose, his demeanor softened. "So you're digging into the Ashwood family," Albert said as he led them into his study. "That's a dangerous rabbit hole you're going down." "Dangerous how?" Emily asked, taking a seat on one of the worn leather chairs. Albert shrugged, settling into his own chair. The Ashwoods weren't just any family. They were powerful, influential. They had secrets they buried along with their dead. There's a reason the manor has been abandoned for so long. "We're starting to see that," Samuel said, "but we're hoping you can help us with something specific. Do you know anything about the man Lillian Ashwood was in love with?" Albert's eyes narrowed, and he leaned back, stroking his chin thoughtfully. "Ah, yes. That story. It's been the subject of speculation for as long as I can remember." "The young man, what was his name?" He paused, his brow furrowing. Thomas Wren. That was it." Emily leaned forward, her heart racing. "Who was he? What happened to him?" "Thomas was the son of a local blacksmith," Albert said. "Handsome, charming, but not the kind of man the Ashwoods would have approved of. He and Lillian met at a church social, if I'm remembering right. It was love at first sight, or so the story goes." Emily's mind raced as Albert continued. They kept their relationship a secret for a while, but you know how small towns are. People started to notice, and eventually word got back to Edward Ashwood. The Ashwoods were furious, of course. Thomas wasn't worthy of their daughter, and they made sure he knew it. "What did they do to him?" Samuel asked. Albert's expression darkened. "That's where things get murky. Some say Edward Ashwood paid Thomas to leave town, gave him enough money to start a new life somewhere far away. Others say he threatened him, his family, his livelihood. And then there are those who believe he had Thomas killed." The words hung heavy in the air, and Emily felt a chill run down her spine. If he was killed, wouldn't there be a record, a police report, a missing persons case? Albert shook his head. "This was the late 1800s, Miss Carter. The Ashwoods had enough money and influence to make problems disappear. If Edward wanted Thomas gone, he would have made sure no one asked questions." After leaving Albert's house, Emily and Samuel sat in the car, the weight of what they'd learned pressing down on them. The streets of Ravenswood were quiet, the occasional street lamp casting pools of yellow light on the cobblestone roads. "Thomas Wren," Emily said, turning the name over in her mind. "If he's the key to all of this, we need to find out what happened to him." Samuel smiled. "Already ahead of you. There's a mention of him in a police report from 1892. Apparently he got into a bar fight at the Blackthorn Tavern and was arrested. He was released the next morning, and after that, there's nothing. It's like he vanished." The Blackthorn Tavern was one of the oldest establishments in Ravenswood, its weathered sign swaying gently in the drizzle as Emily and Samuel pulled up outside. The interior was dimly lit and smelled faintly of beer and wood polish. A few patrons sat at the bar, nursing their drinks despite the early hour. The bartender, a burly man with a thick beard and a friendly smile, looked up as they approached. "What can I get you?" "We're actually here to ask some questions," Samuel said, pulling out a copy of the police report. "About a man named Jonas Fletcher. He was arrested here in 1892. The bartender raised an eyebrow, his smile fading slightly. "That's going back a ways. What's this about?" Emily stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "We're investigating the history of Ashwood Manor. Fletcher worked for the Ashwoods, and we believe he may have been involved in some unsavory activities." The bartender sighed, wiping his hands on a towel. Jonas Fletcher. Yeah, I've heard the stories. My grandfather used to run this place and he talked about Fletcher a lot. Said the guy had a mean streak a mile wide. Always picking fights, always looking for trouble. But there was one thing that really stuck out. "What's that?" Emily asked. The bartender leaned in, slightly lowering his voice. He had a habit of talking too much when he drank. "My grandfather said Fletcher once bragged about burying a man on Ashwood property. Said it was a job well done." Emily's blood ran cold. "Did he say where?" The bartender shook his head. "Not that I know of, but if he buried someone, it would have been somewhere remote, somewhere no one would think to look." As they left the tavern, Emily felt a renewed sense of urgency. If Jonas Fletcher had buried Thomas Wren on Ashwood property, it meant the evidence they needed was still out there. But finding it wouldn't be easy. The estate was vast, its grounds overgrown and untended for decades. Back in the car, Emily pulled out her notebook, flipping through the pages. Lillian mentioned a grove in one of her letters. She told Thomas to meet her there. If Fletcher buried him, it might have been near the grove. Samuel nodded, starting the engine. "Let's go." The rain had stopped by the time they reached Ashwood Manor, but the sky remained overcast, casting the property in a muted grey light. Emily and Samuel stepped out of the car, their boots crunching on the gravel as they made their way toward the overgrown gardens. The grove was located on the far side of the estate, hidden behind a thick wall of ivy and brambles. Emily pushed through the undergrowth, her heart pounding as they entered the small clearing. The trees here were ancient, their gnarled branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out much of the light. "This must be it," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is where she wanted to meet him." Samuel scanned the area, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. If Fletcher buried him here, there might be some sign. Disturbed earth, an old marker, anything. They began to search the grove, their movements slow and methodical. Emily's eyes scanned the ground, looking for anything out of place. Her flashlight beam landed on a patch of earth near the base of a large oak tree, and she froze. "Samuel," she called, her voice tight with emotion. "Over here!" He hurried to her side, his expression grim as he looked at the ground. The soil was uneven, as though it had been disturbed long ago. Emily knelt, her fingers brushing against the dirt. Something protruded from the earth, an old, rusted object that looked like the edge of a shovel. "This is it," she said, her voice trembling. "This is where he's buried." Samuel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll need to call the authorities. If we're right, this could be the evidence we need to prove what Edward Ashwood did." Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. They were closer than ever to uncovering the truth, but she knew the hardest part was still ahead. Lillian's story wasn't just about uncovering the past, it was about justice, and Emily was determined to see it through to the end. The following morning, Emily woke to the sound of rain tapping against the window of her small motel room. She had barely slept, her mind buzzing with the revelations from the previous day. Lillian's imprisonment, Thomas Wren's mysterious death, and Edward Ashwood's role in it all felt like pieces of a puzzle that was slowly starting to fit together. But there were still gaps, unanswered questions that As she sipped her coffee, Emily flipped through the notes she had scribbled in her journal. Thomas's death had been ruled an accident, but everything she had uncovered pointed to foul play. If Edward Ashwood had truly orchestrated his disappearance, someone in Ravenswood must have known about it, or helped him cover it up. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, and she glanced at the screen. It was a text from Samuel. "Meet me at the Ravenswood Historical Society. I've got something." Emily's curiosity flared, and she quickly got ready, pulling on her raincoat before heading out into the drizzly morning. The streets of Ravenswood were quiet, the usual bustle dampened by the weather. As she drove, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The sensation had lingered since her first night at Ashwood Manor, and it seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. The Ravenswood Historical Society was housed in a small, unassuming building near the centre of town. Inside, there was old paper and varnished wood, and the walls were lined with shelves of books, maps, and photographs documenting the town's history. Samuel was waiting for her near a display case filled with artifacts from the late 19th century. "What did you find?" Emily asked, brushing the rain from her hair. Samuel held up a file folder. Property records for Ashwood Manor, specifically transactions and labour contracts from the 1880s and 1890s. Emily raised an eyebrow. Why would labour contracts matter? "Because of this," Samuel said, opening the folder and pulling out a yellow document. "It's a payment ledger from 1890. Look at the date." Emily nodded, her eyes scanning the page. The entry was dated March 8th, 1890, just one day after Lillian's diary ended and Thomas Wren had supposedly drowned. The amount listed was significant, and the recipient's name made her heart skip a beat. "Jonas Fletcher," she read aloud. "Who is he?" Samuel's expression darkened. Jonas Fletcher was a foreman who worked for Edward Ashwood. He oversaw the labourers who maintained the manor grounds. But according to some accounts, he did more than that. Fletcher was known for doing dirty work, the kind of tasks you wouldn't want tied to your family's reputation. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "Are you saying Edward hired him to kill Thomas?" "It's possible," Samuel said. "The timing lines up, and this period is far too large for routine work. My guess is that Fletcher was paid to make sure Thomas never saw Lillian again." Emily stared at the document, her mind racing. If Jonas Fletcher had been involved in Thomas's death, he might have left behind evidence, something that could finally prove Edward Ashwood's guilt. "Do we know what happened to Fletcher?" Emily asked. Samuel nodded. He stayed in Ravenswood for a few years after the Ashwoods left, then disappeared. Some say he moved west, but others think he might have met a bad end himself. The Ashwoods had a way of cleaning up loose ends. Emily couldn't shake the sense that they were getting closer to the truth. If he stayed here, then what were the records? Did you check the town archives? Emily nodded, her heart aching for the young woman who had been punished for following her heart. "Lillian, we found the grove where you were supposed to meet Thomas. We found the disturbed earth. Was he buried there?" The planchette moved to YES. Emily's breath caught. "Was it your father who killed him?" This time, the planchette hesitated, as if the spirit guiding it was reluctant to answer. Then, slowly, it spelled out another word. "Jonas, Jonas Fletcher," Samuel said, his voice low. "Your father's foreman." The candles flickered violently, their flames stretching and bending as though caught in an unseen wind. The scent of lavender intensified, and Emily felt a sudden wave of emotion, grief, anger, and a deep, overwhelming sadness. "Lillian," Emily said, her voice breaking. "We're going to make this right. We're going to tell your story and bring justice to you and Thomas. But we need to know what happened to you after the cellar. How did it end?" The planchette trembled beneath their fingers, then began to move quickly, spelling out a single word. "Fire." Emily's stomach dropped. "Fire? What fire?" The planchette moved again, faster now, almost frantic. "Burn! House! Me!" Samuel's eyes widened. The fire that killed Edward Ashwood, it wasn't an accident. Emily's mind raced. According to the records, Edward Ashwood had died in a fire that consumed part of the manor's west wing. The official report stated that it was an accident caused by a faulty gas line, but now she wasn't so sure. "Lillian," Emily said, her voice trembling, "are you saying the fire was because of you?" The planchette stopped abruptly. The room grew deathly silent, and the lavender scent faded. For a moment, Emily thought the séance was over. But then the piano played a single, mournful note. Emily and Samuel both jumped, their eyes snapping to the instrument. The candles flickered wildly, their flames bending toward the piano as though drawn by an invisible force. "Lillian," Emily whispered, "please, what do you want us to do?" The air grew heavy, pressing down on them like a physical weight. The planchette moved one final time, spelling out a single word: truth. The candles extinguished themselves in an instant, plunging the room into darkness. Emily fumbled for her flashlight, her hands trembling as she turned it on. The beam illuminated the parlor, which was now eerily still. "She wants us to tell the truth," Samuel said, his voice low. "About everything. Her father, Jonas, Thomas, she wants the world to know." Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. "And we will. But first, we need to find proof of the fire. If it wasn't an accident, there has to be evidence somewhere in the house." They packed up their supplies and began to search the west wing of the manor where the fire had originated. The damage was still visible even after more than a century. Charred beams, blackened walls, and the faint smell of smoke that seemed to linger in the air. As they combed through the wreckage, Emily spotted something half buried beneath a collapsed beam. She crouched down, pulling away the debris to reveal a rusted metal box. Her heart raced as she pried it open, revealing a collection of papers inside. Most of the papers were damaged beyond recognition, but one document was still partially intact. It was a letter written in Edward Ashwood's hand, dated the day of the fire. "If this letter is found, let it be known that I did what I had to do to protect my family's legacy. Lillian's choices have brought ruin upon us, and I cannot allow her betrayal to destroy everything we have built. She is gone now, and with her, the shame she carried. I have locked the West Wing to prevent anyone from uncovering the truth. The fire will erase the rest." Emily's breath hitched as she read the letter aloud to Samuel. "He killed her," she said, her voice trembling. "He killed his own daughter and set the fire to cover it up." Samuel's jaw tightened. "We have what we need. This is the proof. We can expose the truth." As they stood there, the house seemed to exhale, the oppressive weight in the air lifting slightly. Emily glanced back toward the parlor, where the piano stood silent. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Hope that Lillian's story would finally be told. The discovery of the disturbed earth in the grove had left Emily and Samuel with a heavy sense of purpose. It wasn't just a lead, it was a confirmation that the story of Thomas Wren had not ended peacefully. But unearthing a century-old mystery required more than physical evidence. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that Lillian herself still had something to tell them. Back at the motel that evening, Emily spread out all the evidence they had gathered: the diary, the letters, the payment ledger, and the notes from their visit to the Blackthorn Tavern. It painted a grim picture, but the puzzle still had missing pieces. If they wanted to bring the full story to light and give Lillian peace, they needed answers. That's when Samuel spoke up. "I think we need to try something unconventional," he said, his voice hesitant. Emily looked up from her notebook. "What do you mean?" Samuel took a deep breath. "A séance. Emily raised an eyebrow. Are you serious? As serious as the evidence we've found, Samuel said. Look, we've already seen things in that house that defy explanation. Lillian's spirit is still there, tied to the manor for a reason. Maybe she can tell us what we're missing. Emily hesitated, her journal still open in her lap. A séance wasn't something she'd ever considered doing, but after everything she had experienced, the visions, the glowing mirror, the piano playing itself, it didn't seem entirely out of the question. All right, she said finally. But we need to do it right. If we're going to communicate with her, we need to approach this with respect. The next evening, armed with candles, a notebook, and a sense of trepidation, Emily and Samuel returned to Ashwood Manor. The house loomed against the dark sky, its windows black and uninviting. The air was colder than usual, and the wind howled through the surrounding trees, rattling the broken shutters. They set up in the parlour, where so many of Lillian's memories seemed to linger. The grand piano stood silently in the centre of the room, its surface covered in a fine layer of dust. Emily placed a row of candles on the piano's edge, lighting each one carefully. The flickering flames cast eerie shadows on the walls, giving the room a haunted glow. Samuel unrolled a piece of cloth onto the floor and placed a small wooden planchette at its centre. The letters of the alphabet and numbers were painted onto the cloth in a circle, forming the makeshift séance board. "This should work," he said, though his voice carried a hint of uncertainty. Emily sat opposite him, the diary open beside her. She placed her hands lightly on the planchette, her heart pounding. Samuel did the same, and they both closed their eyes for a moment, centering themselves. "Lillian," Emily said softly, her voice steady. "If you're here with us, we're listening. We want to help you. Please, tell us what happened to you." The room fell silent, the only sound the faint rustling of the wind outside. Emily held her breath, waiting for something, anything to happen. At first, there was nothing. But then the air grew colder, and a faint scent of lavender filled the room. The planchette began to move. At first, the movement was slow and hesitant, as though whatever force guided it was unsure. Emily's fingers tingled as the planchette slid toward the letter L, then I, then F. "Life," Samuel murmured. "She's talking about her life." The planchette paused, then began to move again, faster this time. It spelled out another word, F-A-T-H-E-R. "Her father took her life," Emily said, her voice trembling. "Lillian, we know he locked you in the cellar. We found your diary, but we need to know why he did it." The planchette stilled for a moment, and Emily felt the air around her grow even colder. Then it began to move again, spelling out another message. "Love him. Shame." Samuel's brow furrowed. He thought her love for Thomas was shameful. He couldn't accept it. Finally, their efforts uncovered a fragment of bone, weathered and yellowed with age. Emily's breath caught as she stared at it, a wave of emotion washing over her. "We found him," she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. "After all this time, we found him." Samuel placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "This is what she wanted. Justice for Thomas, justice for herself." Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. "We need to call the authorities. This is more than a story now, it's evidence. Evidence that proves everything." As they left the grove, Emily felt a strange sense of peace. The truth was finally coming to light, and with it, the possibility of closure for Lillian and Thomas. But she knew their work wasn't done. The story of Ashwood Manor was far from over, and the final chapter would be the hardest to write. Lillian had been silenced for over a century, but Emily was determined to give her a voice. And in doing so, she would ensure that the love Lillian and Thomas shared was remembered, not as a tragedy, but as a testament to the power of love in the face of cruelty. And if Fletcher did the actual killing, Edward would have needed to silence both of them to protect himself. As they spoke, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves overhead. Emily felt a chill run down her spine, and she glanced around, half expecting to see Lillian's ghostly figure standing among the trees. But the grove was empty, or so she thought. A sudden gust of wind sent a flurry of leaves spiraling through the air, and Emily heard a faint, mournful sound, a whisper, barely audible. She froze, her heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Samuel nodded, his eyes scanning the clearing. "It's her. She's here." The whisper grew louder, more distinct, until Emily could make out the words. "Beneath the oak," the voice said, soft and sorrowful. "He lies beneath the oak." Emily's gaze snapped to the massive oak tree at the center of the grove. The bark was gnarled and weathered, its roots twisting deep into the earth. She felt an overwhelming urge to move closer, to uncover whatever secrets lay hidden beneath its ancient branches. Samuel followed her to the tree, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. "Do you think it's true? That he's buried here?" Emily nodded. "It has to be. Lillian wouldn't lead us here for no reason." They began to dig, their hands and a small trowel, pulling away the loose soil around the base of the tree. The work was slow and painstaking, but neither of them stopped. The wind howled around them, carrying with it the faint scent of lavender. The evidence they'd uncovered in the rusted metal box haunted Emily and Samuel as they left Ashwood Manor that night. The rain had returned, drumming against the windshield, as Samuel drove them back into town. Neither spoke for a long time, their thoughts tangled in the weight of the truth they now carried. Edward Ashwood had murdered his own daughter and set fire to his family's legacy to cover it up. The depths of his cruelty were staggering, and the lengths he had gone to protect his name were incomprehensible. But in death, Edward had failed. Lillian's spirit lingered, tethered to the house, waiting for justice. "We have what we need," Samuel said finally, breaking the silence. "That letter, along with everything else we found, it's enough to tell the whole story." Emily nodded, though her thoughts were still spinning. "It's enough to tell Edward's story, but there's still so much we don't know about Lillian, about Thomas." Samuel glanced at her, his expression cautious. "You think there's more?" "I know there's more," Emily said firmly. "Lillian loved Thomas enough to risk everything for him. Her letters, her diary, they all point to something deeper. If we don't tell their story too, then leaving it incomplete." Samuel sighed, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "All right, where do we start?" Emily didn't hesitate. With the people who might have known them, the families who've lived in Ravenswood for generations, someone has to remember Thomas Wren. The next morning, Emily and Samuel returned to Ravenswood's library, where the archivist, Mrs. Holden, greeted them with a warm smile. "You're back," she said, adjusting her glasses. "Still working on that Ashwood Manor story?" Emily nodded. "We're looking for information about a man named Thomas Wren. He lived here in the late 1800s, but we haven't been able to find much about his family." Mrs. Holden's brow furrowed in thought. "Thomas Wren, the blacksmith's son, wasn't he? I think I've heard the name before. Give me a moment." She disappeared into the archives, and Emily and Samuel waited, their anticipation mounting. When she returned, she held a small stack of papers and a faded photograph. "This is what I could find," Mrs. Holden said. said, spreading the materials out on the table. Thomas's father, William Wren, was the town's blacksmith. They lived in a small house near the edge of town, not far from the church. Emily picked up the photograph. Her breath catching. It was a group photo from a church social, taken in 1889. Lillian was there, her smile radiant, standing beside a young man with dark hair and kind eyes. That's him, her fingers tracing the edge of the photograph. That's Thomas. Samuel leaned in, studying Lillian. Looks happy. They both do. Mrs. Holden nodded. They were a beautiful couple, so my grandmother used to say. But their love caused quite a scandal. The Ashwoods were furious when they found out. William Wren tried to protect his son, but there was only so much he could do against a family as powerful as the Ashwoods. What happened to the Wren family after Thomas's death? Emily asked. They moved away, Mrs. Holden said sadly. William couldn't bear to stay in a town where his son's life had been cut short. He sold the blacksmith shop and left Ravenswood for good. Armed with the photograph and Mrs. Holden's insights, Emily and Samuel decided to visit the site of the old Wren blacksmith shop. The building was long gone, replaced by a row of modern houses, but the land itself felt steeped in history. Emily stood in the middle of a small yard, her imagination painting a picture of what it must have looked like in Lillian and Thomas's time. This is where it all began, she said softly. Their love, their dreams, everything started here. Samuel joined her, his hands in his pockets. And it all ended in the grove. It's tragic, really. Emily nodded, her chest tight with emotion. Lillian deserved better, so did Thomas. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the past pressing down on them. Then Emily turned to Samuel, a spark of determination in her eyes. "You need to go back to the grove," she said. "There's something there, I can feel it." Samuel hesitated, then nodded. "All right, let's go." The grove was quiet when they arrived, the overcast sky casting a grey pall over the clearing. The air was cool and damp, and the scent of wet earth filled their lungs. Emily led the way to the spot where they had found the disturbed earth the day before. "This is where he was buried," she said, kneeling beside the patch of uneven soil. Lillian's letters said she planned to meet him here. She was here that night. She must have seen what happened. Samuel crouched beside her, his expression thoughtful. If she saw it, it would explain why her father locked her away. She knew too much. Emily nodded, her fingers brushing against the dirt. The attic was accessed by a narrow staircase hidden behind a door in the second-floor hallway. The steps creaked loudly as they climbed, the air growing colder with each step. When they reached the top, Emily pushed open the heavy wooden door, revealing a cavernous space filled with dust-covered furniture, trunks and boxes. Emily shone her flashlight across the room, her heart pounding as the beam landed on a large trunk in the corner. It was covered in cobwebs, its leather straps cracked and brittle with age. Something about it called to her, and she felt a strange compulsion to open it. Samuel helped her lift the lid, revealing a collection of old documents and personal belongings. There were letters, ledgers, and even a few faded photographs, but what caught Emily's attention was a small, leather-bound journal. She opened it carefully, the pages brittle beneath her fingers. The handwriting was neat, but faint, and the names scrawled on the first page made her breath catch. "Margaret Bennett," she read aloud. "This must be from the family who owned the land before the Ashwoods." Samuel leaned in, his expression intent. "What does it say?" Emily began to read, her voice steady despite the unease that curled in her stomach. March 12th, 1768. "They have taken everything. The Ashwoods came with their papers and their men, claiming they had bought the land fair and square. But we never agreed to sell. This land has been in our family for generations. It is ours by right. April 5th, 1768. We are leaving today. There is nothing left for us here. The Ashwoods have destroyed our crops, burned our barn, and left us with no choice. But they will not prosper from their cruelty. I have spoken the words, and the land itself will remember what they have done. They will never know peace as long as they walk this earth. Emily's voice faltered as she finished the entry, the weight of Margaret's words sinking in. She cursed the land, she said quietly. She cursed the Ashwood family. Samuel let out a slow breath. And it's still holding. Everything that's happened, the tragedies, the hauntings, it all goes back to this. Emily closed the journal, her hands trembling. But why is Lillian still tied to the manor? The curse explains the family's misfortunes, but her spirit is here because of what her father did. Samuel nodded. Maybe it's both. Maybe the curse is what drove Edward to such extremes, the fear of losing everything. It consumed him just like it did his ancestors. Emily stared at the journal in her hands, her thoughts racing. Margaret's curse had set the stage for generations of suffering, but it was Edward's actions that had sealed Lillian's fate. If they were going to bring peace to the manor, they would need to confront both the curse and the choices that had perpetuated its power. As they left the attic, Emily felt a strange sense of clarity. The story of Ashwood Manor was not just one of tragedy, it was a cautionary tale about greed, cruelty, and the consequences of unchecked power, but it was also a story about love, resilience, and the possibility of redemption. "We're going to finish this," she said as they descended the creaking stairs. "For Lillian, for Thomas, for everyone who suffered because of the Ashwoods." Samuel placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression resolute. "We will, together."
Thank you for joining us on this journey through 18 magical chapters. Which chapter spoke to you the most, or helped you feel the calmest? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to know. And if you're ready for another night of soothing stories, don't forget to subscribe and join us again. Sweet dreams, and good night.